So, Shalom Avracha, I hope that this finds us all well under the circumstances. And yeah, Baruch Hashem, it's a time of Achdus. It's a time when the Jewish people are getting together after, prior to Simchat Torah, prior to the 7th of October, there was a terrible weakness among the nation in terms of our cohesion, in terms of our ability to come together. There was divisiveness, there was discord, there was disharmony, there was even animosity. And Baruch Hashem, this is a time of coming together which needs to be strengthened. And today I'd like to speak about one part of that coming together, one element of that coming together, and that relates to the idea of defining the current situation, defining the war. Now, we are currently fighting against the entity of Hamas specifically, and against the Palestinians more generally. Of course, it's the Hamas that might be the armed fighters, the armed warriors, but ultimately it's also a clash of nations. It's a clash of nations that have a rivalry around a piece of land. I think it's very clear that there's a rivalry here, that there's a national entity or a sub-national, a part of a national entity that wishes our destruction, that wishes our conquest, and we have a war against that entity. And the question that I'd like to discuss is how to define that war, which will relate to the question of a Milchemet Mitzvah as opposed to a Milchemet Reshus. There's two types of Milchamot. One of them is an obligatory Milchama, a Milchemet Mitzvah, versus a Milchemet Reshus. Then we'll speak after that categorization. I'd like to speak about what that means. Okay, let's assume that it's a Milchemet Mitzvah. What does that mean for us? What does it mean for our duty as a part of the war effort? And where does it leave us, both in terms of the mindset and in terms of what we're called to do as a part of the war effort? Let me start with the sugya that speaks about Milchemet Mitzvah and Milchemet Reshus. How do you classify the war that we're fighting currently? Is a sugya in Maseches Sotah, Daf Mem Daled. The Mishnah there brings the psukim. The psukim in Sefer Dvarim speak about those who go to war. And the psukim tell us that the shoitrim, the officers, would speak to the people, and they would give them a list of people who should go back from front lines, that it's inappropriate that they should be on the front lines. So somebody who recently betrothed a wife, got married, he should go home. This is not a time. Somebody who recently built a house, somebody who recently planted a vineyard. And then finally it says, right, mi ha-ish ha-yareh v'harach ha-levav, right, Yashuv lebeso, he should go home, and he shouldn't infect others with his fear. That's what the psukim say. There's a yareh v'rach ha-levav, somebody who is weak of heart, somebody who is afraid. And the Mishnah there discusses, who is it that is afraid? Who is this rach ha-levav? Rav Yosef Glili writes, yareh v'rach ha-levav. This is somebody who is afraid because of his chatoim, somebody who is afraid because of the sins that he has sinned, and therefore he's afraid of the war effort. Rabbi Akiva says kipshutai. Rabbi Akiva says it means k'mashmai, somebody who is unable to face the lashon of the Mishnah is kishrei hamilchama, meaning the engagement of battle, and he's afraid of going into battle, and therefore he has to go home. But says the Mishnah at the end of the Mishnah that this applies only to one type of milchama, one type of war. Says the Mishnah, I'll read it out loud. Bameh devarim amurim. What does this speak about? B'milchemes hareshus. This is talking about a voluntary campaign. Milchemet reshus. Aval b'milchemes mitzvah, when we're speaking about a milchama, which is a mitzvah, an obligatory war, then hakol yotzim, everybody goes out to war. Afilu chatan mechadro, a chasan from his cheder, from his chuppah, v'kala mechupasa, the chasan and kala, they go out to war together. The poskim discussed what exactly does the kala do at war, but clearly she can do something. She can be a part of the war effort. That is the first opinion of the Mishnah. There's a second opinion of the Mishnah, which is Rabbi Yehuda. He says, "B'medvar mamurim b'milchemes mitzvah, but milchemes choiva then hakol yotzim," meaning there's a difference in the semantics. According to the first opinion of the Mishnah, there's a distinction between milchemes reshus, an optional mitzvah, an optional war, and a milchemes mitzvah, which is an obligatory war. While according to Rabbi Yehuda, there's a difference between milchemes mitzvah, which there's a mitzvah to fight, and choiva. Choiva is a full obligation, and a mitzvah means a worthy war. It's a mitzvah, it's a worthy war, but it's not a full obligation. Now, let me just read you famous words of the Rambam. Rambam in Hilchas Malachim, in Perek Zayin, he expounds concerning the obligation of a milchemes mitzvah. And he says, Mi ha'esh ha'yorei v'rach ha'levav, right? The person who is afraid. Says the Rambam, like Rabbi Akiva. That speaks about somebody who is weak of heart. Says the Rambam, once you're in a campaign, once you're a part of the war effort, and as we saw in a milchemes mitzvah, everybody needs to be a part of the war effort. We'll get back to that later. Says the Rambam, then there is an obligation of Yishayin al Mikveh Yisrael u'Moshiach. You have to rely on HaKadosh Baruch Hu u'Moshiach be'ez tzara. V'yedash al yichad Hashem u'oiseh milchama. You're fighting for Hashem. This is a milchemes mitzvah. A milchemes mitzvah is a war that we're fighting for HaKadosh Baruch Hu. A milchemes mitzvah, we'll speak about in a moment the parameters of a milchemes mitzvah. It's a war on behalf of Hashem. It's not a personal war. It's not a war for the expansion of our territory. This is a war that we fight on behalf of HaKadosh Baruch Hu. And therefore, Yosim Nafshay Bekapo, you have to be prepared to do all it takes. Don't be afraid. Don't have any kind of concern or fear. Don't, meaning banish from your mind the thought of wife and children. Focus on the war effort alone. And the Rambam says, if you make yourself afraid by starting to think of wife, of family, of what's going to happen, you make yourself in a state of anxiety. Because the pasuk says, Al yerach levavchem, al tiru, al tachbazu. Don't be afraid, don't be fearful. And why not? Because Hashem Elokecha hu ha'holech lefanecha. Because Hashem is fighting. We're fighting the war of Hashem. What is a milchemes mitzvah? Where we find this obligation, right? What is a milchemes mitzvah? So going back to the Gemara, says the Gemara, Amar Rav Yochanan, Reshus the Rabbanon is mitzvah de Rabbi Yehuda. Says the Gemara, Rabbanon and Rabbi Yehuda, they don't have a substantive argument. They're speaking about different semantics. What the Rabbanon called Reshus, optional, Rabbi Yehuda called mitzvah. What the Rabbanon calls a mitzvah, Rabbi Yehuda calls a choiva. Amar Rava, says Rava, Milchemet Yehoshua, the wars of Yehoshua to conquer the land of Israel, that is certainly choiva. That's certainly a milchemes choiva. That's a total obligation. Milchama is based David l'revacha. If we just want to expand our territory, that's reshus. ki plegi, where is there a difference between the Rabbanon and Rabbi Yehuda? That's when we're speaking about English translation, a preventative war, a preventative campaign. Mar karile mitzvah, umar kari rishus. And the difference is, oisik b'mitzvah patur min mitzvah. If you're in the middle of engaging in a war, does this exempt you from other mitzvot that you might be able to fulfill at the same time while you're fighting a war? In any case, what do we learn from the Gemara? That when you have a preventative campaign, you want to make a preemptive strike against an enemy. That preemptive strike is called a Milchemet Rishus, or a Milchemet Mitzvah, according to Rabbi Yehuda, but that's called a Milchemet Rishus. That's not called a Milchemet Mitzvah. But what happens when we're not doing this as a preemptive strike, but rather we're doing this as a defensive war? We're not doing a preemptive strike against a nation in order to deter them, but rather we're fighting a defensive war. So the Gemara doesn't say, the Gemara doesn't tell us what is the status of that milchama. However, the Rambam does, and the Rambam says, this is in Perek Hey of Hilchos Melachim, Halacha Aleph, says the Rambam, Ein hamelech nilcham techila ela milchemes mitzvah. Which war does a king first and foremost need to fight? Milchemes mitzvah. Ve'ezo hi milchemes mitzvah. What is a milchemes mitzvah? Says the Rambam, Milchemes Shivas Hamamim. That's the conquest of the land by Yehoshua. Milchemes Amalek, the war against Amalek. Ve'ezras Yisrael miyad tsar sheba aleihem. And for the salvation of the Jewish people when an enemy comes against us. Says the Rambam, a defensive campaign, a campaign which is a war that's waged in defense against an enemy that strikes against us, that's called a Milchemes Mitzvah. That's an obligatory campaign. That there's an obligation to fight. According to Rabbi Yehuda, that would be called Milchemes Choiva. That there's an obligation to fight. How does the Rambam know that? From where does the Rambam know that a defensive mitzvah is called a Milchemes Mitzvah? It's not mentioned in the Gemara. Says the Chazon Ish, it's implied by the Gemara. Because what does the Gemara say? When is it a Milchemes Rishus? When is it a voluntary and optional mitzvah? That is when it's a preemptive strike. But it comes out, seems obvious from the Gemara, that the only case which is called an optional mitzvah that we can decide to fight or not to fight is a case of a preemptive strike. But defending the Jewish people, of course that's a Milchemes Mitzvah. One could say it emerges from the Gemara. One can also say it emerges from the most basic understanding of what HaKadosh Baruch Hu wants in the world. What does Hashem want in the world? He wants the Jewish people. The Jewish people is B'ni B'chayri Yisrael. Bana Esher B'cha Es Pa'ar. The Jewish people, Am Zu Yatzarti Li, says the Pasuk in Yeshayahu. Hashem created this people for myself, he says. Ti'ilasi Yisaperu. A war against the Jewish people, a war that comes to destroy the Jewish people, then of course, a war that defends against the adversary, against the assailant, the attacker, of course that's a Milchemes Mitzvah. And therefore the Rambam writes, Milchemes Mitzvah. Now Yisachar is asking, what about Lo Tamoid Al Dam Reacha? And you know what? Let me speak about that in just a moment. I'll get to that. I think it's a very important distinction that we need to make. But let's get to it in a moment. First of all, let's ask, what about nowadays? Maybe the Rambam only applies when we have a melech. Maybe the Rambam only applies when we have an Urim v'Tumim. So the Rambam doesn't mention the Urim v'Tumim. The Ramban, in fact, in the Ramban in two places. The Ramban in Mitzvah Dalet, he adds another Milchemes mitzvah, and that is the conquest of Eretz Israel. The Rambam doesn't mention the conquest nowadays of Eretz Israel, but I'll leave that aside. The Ramban elsewhere in Hasagos, this is in Mitzvah Yud Zayin, the Rambam mentions that even in Milchemes mitzvah, you need to ask the Urim v'Tumim. However, in Shut Chavas Binyamin, this is Rav Shaul Yisraeli, he writes and he proves that the Urim v'Tumim is not ma'akev. And like I mentioned, the Rambam doesn't mention at all the matter of the Urim v'Tumim. And it seems from the Rambam, it's true the Rambam writes a melech, but it doesn't seem that the idea of a melech is ma'akev. There were times, many times, in the history of the Jewish people that we didn't have a melech. When we conquered the land of Canaan, Eretz Israel, that was done in the time of the Shoftim, also without a melech. It doesn't seem that the idea of a melech is required for a Milchemes mitzvah. And indeed, we find in the Bach, not just in the Bach, we find in, well, I'll mention the Bach because the Bach is an exceptional halacha. This is a Shulchan Aruch Siman Shin Lamed Tes. The Shulchan Aruch there speaks about when are you allowed to begin to wage a war. And the Shulchan Aruch says that you're not allowed to start a siege against an enemy within 3 days of Shabbos. Says the Bach, what about when we are being attacked? What about when the Jewish people is being attacked? Says the Bach, if we're being attacked, then that's a Milchemes mitzvah. And of course you can start this even on Shabbos. And the Bach says, this doesn't apply only when we're in Eretz Israel. This applies even when we are among the nations and a Jewish settlement among the nations is being attacked, then we should join in with a relevant army of that nation. And that itself is called, says the Bach, a Milchemes mitzvah. Even fighting together with a foreign nation. This is not our army. We're participating in the war of another army. That's called a Milchemes mitzvah when we're defending against a foreign nation. Rav Elyashiv, Kovetz Shuvas, this is the shut of Rav Elyashiv. I think it's in Chelik Beis Simon Mem Gimel. Don't catch me out on this, but I think it's Beis Mem Gimel. Rav Elyashiv was asked about a war here in Israel, a war that's being fought by the IDF. And Rav Elyashiv was asked about the idea of Kedushas Hamachane. The Psukim teach us that we have to, V'haya Machanecha Kadosh. You have to ensure that your camp is Kadosh. And that means you have to ensure that when we have to answer the call of nature, we have to do so outside of the camp and not to defile the camp, right? V'kisisa es te'asecha, to make sure that the camp is not defiled. V'haya mechanecha kodesh. Says Rav Elyashiv, our wars are a Milchemes mitzvah. Rav Elyashiv in Kovish Chuvas. And all of the halachas that are relevant to a Milchemes mitzvah are relevant for our wars also. He was asked this by a soldier. And therefore this is also considered a Milchemes mitzvah. Rabbi Sachar is asking, what about in World War I? Here you have both sides. So would it be a Milchemes mitzvah on both sides? When a Jewish settlement, when we're defending a Jewish settlement, then that would be considered a Milchemes mitzvah. When the Jewish settlement would be in danger from both sides, then that raises a dilemma. Now, who do you fight for? This is a tragic circumstance of many Jewish communities over the years, that the Reds and the Whites. This is in Russia, the Russian wars, they fought each other, but the common denominator was to kill the Jews. So when you have such a situation, don't fight for either side. Flee, escape as much as you can. Of course, each situation in itself. Baruch Hashem, nowadays we're speaking about the war of the Jews upon Jewish land, upon the Jewish sovereign state, the state of Israel, and therefore we can put the Bach. Let's hope that we can put the Bach behind us. I was once asked by a Talmud. He wanted to volunteer for Ukraine to fight against Russia in the Russia-Ukraine war. And I told him, nowadays, there's no excuse to be fighting in any other nation state's army. We have our own nation state. If we want to give our manpower for any war effort, then we should be reserving it for one war effort, for one nation state alone. And that's the Jewish state, the state of the Jews. Al Kol Panim, so we find, as I mentioned in the Bach, Rabbi Yehoshua, and other poskim, that even nowadays, a war which is a war for self-defense is considered a Milchemet Mitzvah. This is a Milchemet Mitzvah. Now, a Milchemet Mitzvah makes a big difference concerning the issue of pikuach nefesh. Rabbi Sacha asks, what about lo tamod al dam reacha? Any case of pikuach nefesh, one has to save another person's life. So if we're being attacked, so of course we have to do everything we can to save lives. But it's not the same. In the Shulchan Aruch, Reish Chaf Tes, if I'm not mistaken, over there the Shulchan Aruch speaks about saving another person's life. What happens if you see somebody else drowning? You see somebody drowning in a river, in a lake, in the sea, and you are able to jump in and to do whatever you can to save the individual who's drowning. Says the Shulchan Aruch, in a case of safek sakana, there's no obligation. Of course, there's an obligation to save somebody who's drowning. But says the Shulchan Aruch and the Noisei Kelim, the Mishnah Brura, expounds on this. There's no obligation to place yourself in safek sakana. It's not imminent danger, but it's a dangerous situation. You might lose your life. You don't have to place yourself in a situation of safek sakana in order to save somebody else's life. In fact, there's a tshuva of Rav Moshe. Rav Moshe writes that unlike other places where you're not allowed to endanger your life, in this case, you're allowed to. It's permitted to endanger your life in order to save somebody else. You're not obligated to do so, but it's permitted to do so. The Radvaz hails against this. He says it's a chassid shoter to place yourself in danger in order to save somebody else. But Rav Moshe says, no, it's something which is admirable. If you're able to do something to save somebody else, even if it means placing yourself in a situation of relative danger, safek sakana, nevertheless, it's something which is permitted and perhaps admirable. Why am I mentioning this? Because all of this is true for a personal instance of lo tamod al dam reacha, like Rabbi Sacha brought up. When we have a personal instance of seeing somebody who is in a state of danger, then if it's getting myself into sakana, into areas of safek sakana, then I'm not obligated. But that's not true for war. When it's a case of war, then the principles of everyday individual pikuach nefesh don't apply. Of course, getting into war is a pikuach nefesh. And of course, we have to get into war. Let me tell you about, meaning we have to get into war when it's a Milchemet Mitzvah. When we're coming to defend the nation, then the excuse of pikuach nefesh becomes irrelevant. There is no pikuach nefesh, like the Rambam said that I read out before. You have to v'yosim nafshoy b'kapoi. Yes, you're going into a place of danger. a place of pikuach nefesh. You have to go and focus on the war effort and relieve any fear from your heart and focus wholeheartedly on fighting the Milchemet Hashem. Then pikuach nefesh doesn't apply anymore. There is no pikuach nefesh. This is, I'll mention a conversation that somebody told me he overheard, somebody that used to work in a bank in Yerushalayim. And he overheard a conversation between a chassid, Hasidic Yid, and somebody religious Zionist, somebody belonging to one of the Dati-Leumi communities, I don't know which one, and the chassid, I also don't know which chassid he was, could have been Vishnitz, could have been Belz, could have been Gur, I don't know. A chassid and a religious Zionist Jew. And the conversation strayed or arrived at family. And the chassid asked this religious Zionist individual, do you have children? Said yes. Do you have any boys? Yes, I have boys. Are you planning on sending your boys to the army? Said, I don't know, sending my boys to the army. My boys will serve in the army, like other Jews living in Israel that we all serve in, the Tzva Ha'am. There's a national army service. I'm proud that my boys will grow up to serve in the IDF, to serve in Israel's army. And the chassid told him, I don't get it. Serving in the army, it's mamash pikuach nefesh. It's a pikuach nefesh to serve in the army. Now clearly the religious Zionist individual, he wouldn't understand this question. But what do you mean pikuach nefesh? Like, of course serving in the army is a pikuach nefesh. That's the whole idea. You're going to fight. You're going to fight a war. Yes, it's a pikuach nefesh, but that's what we do because we need to defend the country. What's the thinking of the chassid, of the Hasidic Yid? The Hasidic Yid is thinking in a godless perspective, which is a very individualistic or communal perspective rather than a national perspective. From an individual perspective, wow, going into the army, you might be killed, right? That's pikuach nefesh. True, when we speak about the everyday individual fulfillment of mitzvahs, when we speak about sakanas nefashos, then yes, l'tamad al dam reacha, and you have to be careful of your own, and you mustn't do anything that endangers you. But if you think on a national level, if you think about waging war, which is what nations do, individuals don't wage wars, but nations wage wars. And of course, when we internalize that we are a nation, when we internalize that Baruch Hashem, the nation, the Jewish nation, has now the tremendous merit of enjoying its own sovereignty in its own state, then pikuach nefesh. The whole language of pikuach nefesh becomes foreign, becomes irrelevant. We're waging a war. Pikuach nefesh man dechar shmei. Now, who needs to go out to battle when there's a Milchemet mitzvah? Well, we saw already in the Mishnah that afilu chason mechadroi v'kala michupasa. Everybody needs to go to war when there's a case of pikuach nefesh. What does that everybody entail? Who does that everybody include? So I'd like to point out the question of Talmidei Chachamim. Do Talmidei Chachamim also go to war when there's a case of pikuach nefesh? So says the Aruch. The Aruch is a Rishon that wrote on the side, it printed annotations on the side of the Gemara. And the Gemara, this is the Gemara in Maseches Sotah also, it's in Daf Yud. And there we find that Asa was punished because he used Talmidei Chachamim for going to war. He used Talmidei Chachamim for going to war. Says to remember which Mefarish is on which Gemara. Which Mefarish is on which Gemara. But on that Gemara, this Gemara Nedarim Daf Lamed Beis, Sota Daf Yud and Nedarim Lamed Beis, similar Gemaras, one of them about Avram Avinu, one about the king Asa, that they both used Talmidei Chachamim for going to war. Says the Maharsha, that's a Maharsha over there, and says the Maharsha, when is it a problem to use Talmidei Chachamim for going to war? That is only in a case of Milchemet Reshus. But Milchemet Mitzvah, says the Maharsha, then of course, even Talmidei Chachamim need to get up and to join the war effort. If you include a Kala Mechupasa and a Chasam Nichadroi, then says the Aruch that I mentioned before, but I'm thinking maybe the Aruch is in Sota Mem Dalet. I have to look it up again exactly where it is. But the Aruch says, if a Chasam and a Kala need to go to war, Kal V'chomer, that even a Talmid Chacham, Talmidei Chachamim, need to go to war. And indeed, the Kehillat Ohr is on the Gemara in Sota, and he says, Milchemet Mitzvah, everybody goes, and even Talmidei Chachamim, Trichem Libatel Melimudam, even Talmidei Chachamim need to go to war. Yehoshua was Gadol Adar, and he fought the war, and at night he was requested to, there was a demand upon him to learn. But even Talmidei Chachamim need to go to war. In fact, I heard from some Bachurim in Hebron, Yeshivas Hebron, that the Rosh Yeshiva, Rav Chevroni, he addressed them on Shabbos, and he said, listen, what's going on today is a Milchemet Mitzvah. And in principle, each one of us would need to leave Yeshiva and to go to fight Milchemet Mitzvah, all of us. That would be our obligation. We don't have training. We don't know how to hold a gun. And therefore, we're better off staying in Yeshiva. If we'll go to the army right now, it'll only make things worse. So we're better off learning in Yeshiva for the schus of the Jewish people and the schus of the campaign. But in principle, we should all be going out to war. Rabbi Yisachar is asking, what about Milchemet Mitzvah or Pikuach Nefesh? No, Milchemet Mitzvah. Pikuach Nefesh is something else. The Chazon Ish, I'm speaking about Milchemet Mitzvah, not about Pikuach Nefesh. The Chazon Ish speaks about what about a case of Milchemet Reshus when it's a Pikuach Nefesh. And then we have to fight the Milchemet Reshus because of Pikuach Nefesh. But Milchemet Mitzvah is not related to the terminology of Pikuach Nefesh, doesn't enter into the framing of a Milchemet Mitzvah. Milchemet Mitzvah, said Rav Chevroni to his disciples in Hebron, in principle, we would all have to go to fight the war. Now, why is this so important? I think this is vital for us to internalize. It's vital for everybody to internalize, because if we are all obligated to fight in a Milchemet Mitzvah, even a Chasan and Kala, even Talmidei Chachamim, everybody, if everybody is obligated to fight in a Milchemet Mitzvah, so those soldiers who are actually fighting on the front lines on our behalf are in fact fighting our war, meaning they're doing our shlichus. We should be there. We all need to be there. The Chazon Ish even discusses, what about if there's no need for more soldiers? And he says on one side of the argument, he says, even if the army says there's no need, Milchemet Mitzvah, everybody has to go. Because maybe things will change, because maybe there'll be a need. Milchemet Mitzvah, we all need to go to the front line. We all need to be a part of that effort, of that collective effort. I think the word collective is exactly the right word. Milchemet Mitzvah is a milchama of HaKadosh Baruch Hu. A milchama of HaKadosh Baruch Hu, by nature, inherently includes the entire Jewish people. It's not a milchama of one tribe or another tribe. It's not a milchama that is for those who need a bit more living space and don't have enough living space. It's a milchama of the Jewish people. And therefore, everyone is automatically included. And therefore, those on the front lines are fighting literally on our behalf, not on our behalf that they're defending us, but it's our war. We need to be there with them. The fact that we're not there is because of whatever it is, because we don't know how to hold a gun, because we'll only make things worse, because the army is telling us to stay at home. But you know what? We're also here in order to provide whatever support we can for the war effort. And that support becomes an absolute obligation. It's not just, hey, I want to volunteer to do what I can, kol hakavod, you're volunteering so nicely. No, the milchama is our milchama. We are all soldiers. It's so important to internalize this. It's not just a matter of supporting because we want to help out. No, this is our obligation. It's our war. We are all soldiers in the war. It's a Milchemet Mitzvah. It includes every one of us. And therefore, whatever we can do to support the war effort isn't just a nice thing to have. It's an absolute shiur. What is it that we can do to support the war effort? That's already a good question, and that depends on circumstances. But you know what? There are some very basic things that we can all think about as supporting the war effort, even if it's not in a direct way. We're not jobnikim, we're not doing the immediate support that the army needs, we're not in the army, but nevertheless, in an indirect way, this supports the war effort. And I'm speaking about things like going Chalila to Levayas, when there's a Levaya of soldiers who were killed in battle as part of the Milchemet Mitzvah, Kadoshim, who were killed defending the Jewish people, then going to the Levayas supports the effort. It supports the morale. It indicates that we're all a part of it. If we're all a part of it, then we need to be at the Levayas, of course. There are shiva houses. Again, Rahman al-Islam, we should know no more losses. But if they are, then we need to visit them. That's supporting the war effort. If we're able to send letters, if we're able to visit bases, if we're able to provide food and support and different provisions, like the different operation rooms around the country, we have, Baruch Hashem, some of them in Ramot, then of course that's a part of the war effort. If we're able to strengthen the families of soldiers, whether it's husbands, whether it's children, boys or girls who are in the IDF, then strengthening those families is a part of the war effort. When we daven, davening is not a privilege, it's not an option. We all need to be davening. The Medrash says in Bamidbar, Elef Lamata, over there, it was a milchama that only had a few soldiers, 1,000 each. Says the Medrash, there were others who were designated to daven. We are all designated to daven. Not a luxury. It's a basic obligation. We are all part of the war effort. And I was thinking for myself, I have, many friends, some family members, not direct, who are in the IDF, who are fighting our Milchemet Mitzvah. But I need to feel exactly the same as a parent that has a child fighting now in Gaza, who is some nafshay bekapoi. The amazing questions that you receive, families that, should we write a letter to our child in Gaza? Maybe it will distract him, like the Rambam says, should be thinking only about the war. And I think that our soldiers are strong enough. They'll fight the war, but they'll fight the war on our behalf. When we express our love, when we express our support, family, friends, whatever it is, then this strengthens the morale of the soldiers. But all of us should be acting in our davening, in our support, in everything we do, as though we have our own children, because it's us, because we need to be there. It's as though we are on the front lines ourselves. That's the nature, that's the special nature of a Milchemet mitzvah. And that's what's going on here. This is a milchama against an enemy that's sworn our destruction. This is a war against an enemy that will not relent until all of us are in the sea, until Palestine is Judenrein. That's the nature of our enemy. This is Ezras Yisrael Miyad Atzar Aleim. This is exactly the Rambam's Milchemet mitzvah. And therefore, all of us are a part of the campaign. And you know what? Even B'Medinas Hayam, even in the United States, I was disappointed at the call of certain Rabbanim who said, don't go to the rally because it's not for B'nai Torah. You know, there are times during which we want to be makpid on the very nitty-gritty of what B'nai Torah do and what B'nai Torah don't do. But when we're in the middle of a war campaign, when we're in the middle of a Milchemet mitzvah that all of us, even those in the United States, need to be a part of, defending the Jewish people against its enemies, then we go an extra mile. Then even if it's things that, B'nai Torah, do we participate in demonstrations? Do we brush shoulders with, those who are not B'nai? There's a time for that. And there's a time when we say, you know what? This is a Milchemet mitzvah. Whatever it takes to support Israel in its battle, whatever it is that can strengthen Israel in any way, is something that we need to do right now. To do whatever it takes, because that's our obligation. Because right now we are all soldiers. So that's what I wanted to speak about today. It's a mindset. It's a mindset that I feel that some have internalized, but that not everybody has internalized. It's a mindset that we need to spread, that we need to make sure that everybody understands, everybody internalizes. This isn't a private war. This is not something that we can fight with, a few army guys, milchama shelahem, as some like to say, hem nilchamim. They're fighting the war. It's hem ve'anachnu. Here there's no hem ve'anachnu. I don't think there's ever a place for the hem ve'anachnu. But when there's a Milchemet mitzvah, then the Torah tells us there's no place for hem ve'anachnu. There's no them and us when we're speaking about a Milchemet mitzvah. It's only one collective we fighting the war of HaKadosh Baruch Hu. And just like the soldiers are not allowed to be afraid, also we mustn't be afraid. We mustn't relax in our efforts. We need to strengthen our resolve, to strengthen our morale, and to do everything, both spiritually and our davening, of course, and also in the field, whatever it is that we can do. And there's something that each one of us can do in participation with the war effort. That's what I wanted to speak about today briefly. I'll be happy to take questions if there are any. Question from Ricky: can your videos be posted in one place? I will try to arrange that. I seem to have lost the last one, unfortunately, but I'll try to find them all and post them in one place. Yes. Thank you. Any other substantive questions? That's a technical question.
Thank you, Rabbi Pfeffer.
Thank you, Rabbi Sacha. Thank you to everyone. There's no further questions. God willing, we'll reconvene Be'ezer Hashem next week. And for the meantime, all the very best. We'll finish with a prayer. Kadosh Baruch Hu should, like the pasuk says, Yad be'oivenu tachtenu. Kadosh Baruch Hu should give our enemies into our hands. We should have the resounding victory we all need. The campaign is not finished. There's time left. We don't know where it will head. We are sure that HaKadosh Baruch Hu will guide us to victory against our enemies. The Milchemet mitzvah is his milchama. It's the war of Hashem. We all need to be a part of it. B'sarah tova to all of us. All the very best.